good evening and welcome to Housmans. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. For those of you who haven't been here before, Housmans is one of the oldest and few remaining radical bookshops in the UK. We're based in King's Cross. We're currently open in store and for online orders, but for the foreseeable future, our events program is entirely online. We've got a lot more talks and events coming up over the next few weeks, so if you want to join us, please have a look on our website. I'll pop all the links in the chat for you, and we'd love to see you at some more events. Thank you especially to those of you who are here who've bought solidarity tickets to tonight's event. It's incredibly important to us that we keep everything as affordable and accessible as possible, so those of you who've done that are really helping us to keep running these kind of talks and events. We're really pleased to host this event on behalf of Dog Section Press, who have published the amazing Abolishing the Police, which is one of our biggest selling titles of the year so far. So thank you so much to everyone who's joined us tonight. We're joined by Koshka Duff, who's the editor of the book, and 4 of the contributors with different essays. Koshka is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Nottingham with interests in social and political philosophy, German philosophy, and the philosophy of music. She participates in strikes, protests, and other forms of struggle around education, housing, sexual and reproductive justice, and policing, and was a co-organizer of Cops Off Campus. Our other panelists are in absolutely no order. Eddie Bruce Jones, who is a reader in law and anthropology at Birkbeck, University of London. He teaches race, law and literature, transformative lawyering, and other courses. He's also the author of Race in the Shadow of Law, State Violence in Contemporary Europe. Becca Hudson is a researcher and campaigner in criminal justice issues. Her research focused on the relationship of psychiatric diagnoses to prison building projects, both in Britain and its empires past and in British prisons today. She's been involved in a number of campaigns around criminalisation and policing. Chris Rossdale is a lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of Bristol. He's written about social movements, rebellious politics, and militarism and state violence, including in his 2019 book, Resisting Militarism, Direct Action and the Politics of Subversion. He's also been involved in various anti-war and anti-arms trade campaigns. And finally, Sarah Lamble is an organizer with Abolitionist Futures, and a founding member of the Bent Bars Project, which coordinates a letter writing program for LGBTQ+ prisoners in Britain. Lamble teaches criminology at Birkbeck, University of London. So there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you've got any questions for our panelists. And there's also a chat where you can talk to the other attendees and where I'll post useful links to how to buy the book and more information on our website. If you feel like tweeting about the event, we are at Housmans Books and we'll get started. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Alice. I said I'd sort of throat clear for us and say a few words about what this book is and why we wrote it. And really, I mean, you know, conversations about police abolition have been on the rise in the UK over the last few years, but this feels like a particularly appropriate year for that book to come out. In the context of the Tories' new Police Powers Bill, in the context of the massive protests against that bill and the huge amounts of state repression, in the context of the intensified focus on police violence against women. Obviously, right now, COP is happening in Glasgow, and I'm sure you've all been seeing kind of stories about the very aggressive policing that's being directed at protesters and others that are in Glasgow at the moment. And as there's more attention than ever on police violence and police powers, there's also a huge amount of activity about responses to police power. Again, in the news the last few weeks has been the massive increase in people wanting to take part in local police monitoring. A particularly kind of interesting form of abolitionist politics with a very long history to it that some of us might talk about. So this has felt like a really good year to have a book on abolishing the police out. The point of the book is that it collects together a series of essays written by about 12 of us, kind of coming at the context and the idea of police abolition from different directions. And what we're going to do this evening is that the 4 of us who have written those chapters are going to answer questions that Koshka is going to fire at us initially, and then hopefully will come from the rest of you for the rest of the session. So I'll pass over to Koshka, who can take us on from there.
Oh, thank you so much. And yeah, thank you to Housmans and to everyone for coming. I wanted to draw attention to what I think for me and for us has been a really key aspect of the book and what we've had in mind all the time when we've been writing it, which is that it's really pointless to have great theory that nobody can understand, and that making a book and participating in a conversation is kind of about policing and abolition is something that is kind of has to be connected up with all kinds of struggles against state violence, and so making the volume accessible, as well as kind of theoretically rigorous and innovative, has been the most important thing for us. And one of the ways in which we have been doing that is that, as well as kind of trying to make sure that the pieces are very readable and all kinds of potentially unfamiliar vocabulary is explained, we've also got an online glossary, which gives longer explanations of all of the kind of potentially unfamiliar vocabulary, and thinking about the different contexts in which people might be discussing, learning, coming together to talk about, teaching about policing and abolition. We've also come up with a kind of study guide or a bunch of questions to support reading and sharing and communicating around the book. And so that's what I'm going to be drawing on now. There's a kind of QR code in the book which you can scan, and then that will take you to all these resources online, and we'll be adding to that more in the future. But that's where I'm taking these questions from. So I'm gonna, who's gonna be in the hot seat first? Maybe I will start off actually with Chris, because yours is the very first and fantastic first essay in the book. And I want to ask you, you begin with a description of DICE and DSEI, and I want to ask you, what is that, and what does it show us about global policing?
Thanks, Koshka. It seems very unfair to begin with me when I valiantly spoke first as well, but I'll take that one. So DSEI is an arms fair that takes place in London every couple of years, every other September. So you might have seen it on the news around that time, in part because it attracts massive protests. It's, depending on how you rank your arms fairs, it's one of the biggest or the biggest arms fair in the world. You can see everything on display, from Apache helicopters to crowd control equipment, and sort of everything that the modern border force, security force, army, police force needs. And I've been involved in protests against DICE for quite a long time now. And a lot of my research has also thought about kind of protests against arms fairs and what we learn from protests against arms fairs. So in the context of this chapter, I was using DICE to jump off thinking about different ways we can understand what policing is. Because I think arms fairs like DICE are a site where we see kind of, there are three kinds of policing that get enfolded in these arms fairs. One of them kind of is related to the fact that the arms fair is located in a very highly policed borough in London, in Newham, where you have huge amounts of activity from immigration enforcement, from police. You have very racialized policing within Newham. But part of the reason the arms fair takes place in Newham is that it's also a part of London where people aren't considered politically very important or influential, and so less likely to object to this happening there. So there's a kind of a register of policing that is around what's the local space in which the arms fair takes place. And then there's another more obvious register of policing, which is that protests against the arms fair are very heavily policed. The police use anti-terror legislation. Often the police engage in very aggressive, often violent policing of the protests. But the one I'm thinking about in the piece, and the one that often seems less obvious, is the arms fair itself as a kind of nodal point in global circulations of policing. Like at these arms fairs, we see the sale of equipment, we see the circulation of expertise, we see the kind of circulation of an ideology of what it means to police populations at a global level. What kinds of equipment, what kinds of understanding, what kinds of relationships enable militaries, border forces, police organizations from around the world to police their people. And the chapter I've written is essentially a meditation on what it means to recognize the arms fair, not as a site of war, but as a site of policing. The normal refrain we have is to talk about the militarization of the police, right? The police are becoming more like an army, is a kind of common line of criticism you see of the police. And I think there's stuff that we can talk about there. But I think there's we also need to think about the inverse of that. Maybe what's less important than the militarization of the police is the recognition that war, that militaries are themselves police forces, themselves involved in global politics of policing. So I'm asking, how does war operate as a form of policing? And beyond war, I'm thinking about military interventions, peacekeeping operations, the many hundreds of military bases around the world, counterinsurgency operations. I think it's important to recognize all of those as forms of policing, forms of managing and preserving a particular form of public order and international order. So here we're thinking about not police forces as particular institutions with a capital P on the front of them, but policing as a practice and a strategy of administering structural violence and as a way of managing unruly populations, of maintaining the vulnerable status of populations that might become unruly, or that it is productive for, to put it bluntly, capital to remain vulnerable in whatever form. So, if we think about war, military intervention, peacekeeping, counterinsurgency as a form of policing, our frame of reference for what abolition means starts to expand quite dramatically. If we think about the arms fair as essentially a carnival of global policing, where you have people meeting from around the world, sharing strategies, sharing information, sharing tactics, and crucially sharing equipment, what you get is a nodal site in a network of global policing that I think is really integral to how global capitalism functions, global imperial relations function. Like the arms trade becomes a site of circulation for police power. The reason I'm thinking about that in the piece isn't only because I'm an IR scholar and I get paid to make everything international, though that's part of it. Partly it's about recognizing that we need to expand our understanding of what abolition of the police would mean. Abolition of the police doesn't just mean the abolition of particular discrete institutions. It means the abolition of policing as a strategy for administering social order, policing as a strategy for maintaining a political system that requires coercion in order to function because it exists to the detriment of so much of the world's population. And part of the logic of that is to think more internationally, but part of the logic of that is also to come back to the local. So I began with Newham, like the technologies that circulate through Dicey, the technologies that circulate internationally, the technologies that get developed in kind of colonial operations around the world, circulate back to the streets of London. They circulate back to the local context. That's not just a spiraling out to the international. It's a recognition that part of how policing functions at the local level is through those global circulations of police power that extend beyond police as an institution to think about networks of militarism, the arms trade, military bases, and so forth. So that's some of what I'm trying to do in that chapter.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was an absolutely brilliant introduction to what we mean by policing in the book, and thinking about policing as a practice and as a set of practices. I think that's a wonderful kind of segue into your work, Lamble, where you talk about abolition also as a practice, and your chapter practicing everyday abolition. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about what that means to you, and particularly you kind of make use of these terms carceral and punitive to describe kind of cultures and logics in our everyday lives. And could you say a little bit more about what you understand by them and what it means to oppose them or unpick them?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I wrote this piece, Practicing Everyday Abolition, I think in part because of what you were sort of referencing before about I think there's sometimes a gap when people think about abolishing the police or abolishing prisons. It feels like something that's very far away, or it feels like people often say that's utopian, or, you know, it's like hard to imagine what the world would, what it would take for us to actually dismantle the police and dismantle the prison system. And so I was trying to write the piece to get people to think beyond just kind of dismantling those institutions, and trying to get people to understand that those institutions are actually sustained by cultures and norms that reinforce a kind of assumption that if a harm happens or a crime happens, we're kind of taught to believe that the appropriate response to that is to inflict more harm on someone else. So if you look at a traditional definition of punishment, punishment is the deliberate infliction of harm on someone else as a response to wrongdoing. Now we try and dress it up and say, no, it's like just desserts, or it's deterrence, or it's something else. But at the end of the day, when you lock someone in a cage, you are inflicting harm on them as a response to a harm that they may or and sometimes may not have done. And the question I think we need to ask is, what is that achieving? And I think it's clear over and over and over, whether we're talking about that infliction of harm at the level of the police or at the level of prisons, or we're talking about it in kind of a very everyday context, it's not an effective strategy. It doesn't actually reduce harm, it just creates more harm. And so, we get people who have engaged in harm often because of traumatic experiences they've had, or social deprivation, or they've been abandoned in some way, and they respond to that social abandonment through harm. And then we see just harm escalate and kind of ratchet up. So I was trying to write a piece that was getting us to think about what we need to do in the everyday context here and now in order to work towards building a world that we don't have to rely on prisons, or we don't have to rely on police, because those things aren't working to keep us safe. It's a mythology that they do work to keep us safe. And if we actually want meaningful safety, we need to undo this thing that equates justice and punishment. I don't think justice is ever achieved through punishment. And so the piece is really trying to think about that. And so I kind of make, a few kind of hopefully simple points, which is the first thing we need to do is undo what I call carceral cultures. And so that's the kind of punishment logics that are embedded in everyday cultures. You think about the way in which we might respond when someone does us wrong, and we respond in a kind of punitive way to them in an interpersonal context or in a work context. And it's thinking about why that's normalized as a response. Like, why is that our frame of reference? And why aren't we asking, if someone has wronged me in some way, why has that happened? And what needs to be done to address that, as opposed to kind of retaliating with a kind of punitive response. And so part of it is trying to get us to think about all the ways in our everyday lives in which punishment is normalized as a response to harm, and to get us to shift our response and to challenge that. And in order to do that, the kind of second point is that we need to think about how we respond to harm differently. And I think when a harm occurs, again, whether it's an act of violence, or whether it's a kind of someone retaliating, or someone hurting someone in some way, we have a tendency to respond to that with punishment, or with exclusion, or with some sort of separation. And really, when a harm occurs, I think it's a sign that there's a need for support and care. And actually, so we need to move away from responses that are kind of retaliation and move towards the support and care piece. And in order to do that, we need to build up our skills. And there's lots of people who are doing amazing work every day to build up our skills and our capacity to respond to harm in ways that get to the root of that, the causes of harm, and try and find other ways of addressing harm that are more about reparation, that are more about support, that are more about healing. And I think, so the piece is really trying to get at some of those things and some of those practices so that we can shift those cultures and we can shift institutions in order to lay the groundwork that makes it possible for us to dismantle, violent institutions like prisons and police.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lamble. Eddie and Becca, in my introduction, I put your pieces next to each other because I felt that they spoke to each other in a lot of ways. And although they're kind of talking about quite different contexts, Eddie, you're reflecting on your experiences in a prison education program in the US. Becca, you're writing about the kind of the far right and policing in the UK context. A really kind of a common thread that emerged from both of them for me is the way that the kind of official violence perpetrated by state institutions and agents like the police, like border guards, like prisons, is kind of so often supported and or furthered by unofficial forms of violence that are meted out, for example, by far right organizations and their sympathizers, by the KKK, white supremacist organizations, and so on. So I felt that both of your pieces were really looking at the way that official policing is in a way just the kind of tip of the iceberg. But I wanted to kind of ask you in your own words what you would say that the kind of main contribution of your piece was to the volume. Maybe I could start with you, Eddie. How do you see what you wrote as fitting into this discussion?
Thanks, Koshka. And I was honored to be asked to contribute something to this volume, partly because I don't necessarily work very theoretically or very directly with thinking through abolition. And I've learned so much from my colleague, Sarah, who I've known now for a decade, and have really learned a lot about thinking beyond just the idea of abolition being kind of a destination way down the line, and thinking of it being kind of an everyday, an approach and a set of practices and skills and commitments. And for me, I think it was a moment that I wrote this piece in 2015. So it was after, Mike Brown and, a whole slew of people who were just killed in the US. And the level of visibility, of course, was just on a different scale as I'd experienced in the past. And that led me to kind of really interrogate how I thought about the use of prosecuting police in the service of some larger vision that would include an abolitionist commitment, because it was like, every news station you turn on, you see a press conference where people are demanding really long sentences for these police. And it almost even probably, inadvertently, and of course, I'm not saying that the families who are pushing for these, for this prosecution don't have an abolitionist perspective, because I think, part of the tension I'm trying to unpick is the fact that many of us who do use the law do also have abolitionist commitments, but then we're, in the language of legality, are roped right back into to having the most immediate form of using the law be one that is so wedded to certain ideas of how the law should then be penal, and how we should see that as the only option on the road to something different. And it's very, so it awakened in me this kind of the Toni Morrison quote, which was about racism, but it really makes an interesting parallel between the distraction of having to always justify yourself or prove yourself against claims, racist claims to your lack of intelligence or inability to produce knowledge or art. And that's what Morrison, I think, really was concerned with. But then, she called it a prison. She called that dynamic imprisonment. And I think there's a real, way in which that correlates in a much more profound and theoretical sense within thinking through strategies of using the law. Because it's very problematic to use prosecution in that instrumental way and just simply reproduce this idea that it's an individual who's now committed some crime rather than a whole structure, a whole system that we are also reproducing when we're using the criminal justice system in that way. So I think it's just worth thinking about it through the lens of, I think it opens up something to use the lens of a literary approach to kind of get us to think about the flip side of that, which is the racism. And I think for me also, it's really interesting to think about that in terms of prison education, because that was an experience that really changed the way that I saw my role as an educator, but also the possibility of doing something that you think is alleviating some form of harm in the present. But that's the tip of the iceberg, like you said, Koshka, that there's so much more to have to deal with that's potentially also made worse by the fact that you're in the prisons, giving legitimacy to the educational department of the prison by rendering services that are then going to improve something, but actually not the things that we really want improved. They're just going to really improve the status of the prison. So yeah, I think my contribution was me trying to work those things out on paper, not resolving them, but hopefully raising those questions for others who are doing work and feeling like that work is problematic and really not knowing where to go with it.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, I think this, like unpicking the complexities and the problems with attempts to use the law to challenge state violence and kind of use the law against itself in a way, that is a really nice way of posing the question to you, Becca, which is because when we think about the far right and kind of white supremacist fascist organizations, their sympathizers, but and the kind of the very real violence that they perpetrate, often that is a moment when people who might otherwise be critical of the police start to kind of backpedal, and they say, oh no, but we do need the police to keep the far right in check. You know, let's not be over hasty in criticizing the police. All the ones who are going to protect us from the kind of white supremacist, oh, my internet connection is unstable. I hope it's not too unstable. And so I kind of want to ask you, Becca, you know, what would you give a very different analysis of the relation between the police and the far right than that one which I think we very, very often hear, which is that the police are there to protect us from the far right. What would you kind of say in response to that?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, in some ways, it's true, right? And in some ways, the kind of stuff that I'm saying in my piece, which is in lots of ways about like fascist strategy and tactics, and the moments in which they coalesce with right establishment strategy and tactics, and it's just, I guess, tried to sketch the ways in which sometimes those interests really tightly overlap. And we see within a matter of days and weeks, the state kind of taking far right demands and programs and, you know, lines and messaging, and just very quickly incorporating it into the state's own response to some kind of social, political, economic crisis. And the particular example that I use comes from the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in London in 2020, where there was then a counter demonstration of a kind of really, I mean, not all of them are kind of outright fascist or far right, but a really kind of like broad coalition of hard right and going up to fascist and far right groups who were kind of counter demonstrating against Black Lives Matter protesters, purportedly because they had desecrated the statues of the statue in London of Winston Churchill and in Bristol of Edward Colston. and the way in which the state then very quickly, again, like rapidly and in a number of days, kind of incorporated accusations, programs and demands from far-right protesters on the street that day into its own management of Black Lives Matter. So the kind of core example in terms of legislation is that fascist far-right counter-protest was because people harmed statues. They caused criminal damage to statues. Criminal damage, of course, already an existing criminal offence for which people can, serve quite long stretches of time. But they then created, because of this kind of outcry about what had happened to these statues as a result of Black Lives Matter protesters' actions, and also, I don't think insignificantly, as a kind of a counterweight to the mass mobilization in support of Black Lives Matter, which we saw geographically dispersed across the UK. I mean, these were some of the largest anti-racist mobilizations this country's ever seen. As part of their kind of counterattack to that, they then created a special criminal offence, which was about causing criminal damage to statues that had some kind of important national and nationalist meaning, so like Winston Churchill and war statues. And there is now in the policing bill, which we see going through Parliament, which incidentally has also caused mass mobilizations and Kill the Bill protests, there is a part of that bill which puts forward that if you are convicted of desecrating a statue that has national meaning in this way, you can go to prison for up to 10 years. So a separating out of this existing offence of criminal damage into something very specific that comes out of that context. So that's kind of that particular relationship, but I don't want to claim that that is something that happens all of the time. There are moments in which it overlaps and coalesces. And I think the kind of main argument I'm making is that like policing can only ever go rightwards, that demands on this institution get dragged in that direction, much more likely than they have ever to be dragged in the other direction. But the kind of position that you're talking about of people thinking that, the frightening and violent and rabble-rousing kind of far-right protests and people and frightening organizations that we see and we hear about and we may come into contact with, that the police are there in order to kind of stop them for us. That's not something which is like entirely untrue or never happens, right? I mean, anybody who's been on an anti-fascist mobilization in, at least the last 10 years in this country will have seen both of these things happening. You will see the police oftentimes being incredibly heavy-handed with the kind of anti-fascist mobilization on that kind of a demonstration and facilitating much more often the far-right element of the kind of counter demonstration to go ahead. I've been in situations where police have cordoned off roads and kind of trapped anti-fascist protesters in one road while far-right demonstrators are allowed to come in and out of this kind of pen in which we're being held. But there are also times in which you have these kind of two like demonstrations buffered by a layer of police. And I've also been in situations where I've kind of been on an anti-fascist demo that the police are like semi-leading because there's this like buffer zone of like heavily like not armed in the sense of having weapons, but armed in the sense of having like riot gear, police that are separating the anti-fascist and the fascist contingent on demonstrations. And of course, we've seen ways in which far-right groups like National Action have been then listed as terrorist organizations, and that's led to convictions and prosecutions. So I don't think it's something that doesn't happen or never happens, but I guess the point of the piece, and it does very much link to the kind of problems that Eddie's drawing out in terms of what do these tactics and these tools offer us, and what are the kind of features and textures of these tools? Who are they for? How have they been made? How do they normally operate? And I suppose overall the piece with that kind of example of the statues and the Black Lives Matter protesters and the way in which both the state and the far right use that as a kind of way to counterattack is just making an intervention in saying, well, actually, the main way that these institutions operate, the relationship that they have, there is a clear pattern, which means that policing can only ever go rightwards, and that actually making demands on these kinds of institutions will basically come back to bite us. And I think we see this in, you know, lots of abolitionist campaigns, people at the moment talking about things like making misogyny a hate crime, right? And the abolitionist kind of criticism of that is that, like, well, this doesn't, as Lamble was talking about, this doesn't protect us. This doesn't serve the purpose which it's kind of being sold to us to serve. And more often than not, the way in which the violence which this organization does as part of its kind of daily bread will just be doubled down upon. If we get misogyny or kind of catcalling listed as a hate crime and a criminal offense, we're just going to see an increase in the number of poor, racialized men subject to police violence, which is what the police do on a day-to-day anyway, right? And I guess the contribution in terms of the piece is just trying to say, I think that's how these organizations operate. And I think that, you know, the smarter elements of far-right tacticians know that, and they use their demands and their interventions with regards to policing very, very kind of consciously, knowing that that's how that institution works.
Fantastic, thank you, Becca. I'd really like to, now that we're kind of 40 minutes in, to open up to questions from all of the participants, the wonderful participants who we tragically cannot see, but we know that you're there. So if you'd like to just start typing your questions into the chat, then I think that we should be able to see them, and then I can start putting them to our panelists. So get typing away. And in the meantime, I think I kind of just want to open up a bit of a free-for-all conversation amongst you. There was a question that I put in to kind of every chapter, which was, you know, what's an example of policing or a fact about policing that you find particularly surprising or shocking or affecting in some way, and just maybe to talk a little bit about you know, how you found this thing out. You know, why did you have the reaction that you did to it, and what you think it shows about policing. So kind of any of you can jump in, and I'll keep an eye on the chat for questions coming in from the audience.
I can say one fact. I think one of the most, I don't know if it's surprising, but I guess surprising when I learned it at the time, and I don't know if this works just for policing, but is that the UK actually imprisons a larger proportion of its Black population than the US, which is one fact I remember learning. And I guess the thing that I took away from that is that this claim that, yes, there's racism in the US. Yes, they have a very troubled racial history. Yes, that's not something that happens here. Or, you know, we live in a liberal democracy that upholds certain standards of equality, that we have this thing called policing by consent, by which British police behave, and the entire criminal justice system, including prisons, behaves in far more kind of above board, fair, equal, liberal ways. That particular fact just really demonstrated to me the kind of how false all of those kind of claims and all of that ideology around that was, and encouraged me to kind of interrogate more the extremely deliberate and systematic way in which the British criminal justice system is and has been racist.
Amazing, thank you. I've now found the Q&A, guys. So I have got a couple of questions coming in. So one question is for Eddie in particular, and asking what you make of the move by Larry Krasner, Philly DA, District Attorney is that, to encourage those on the liberal left in the States to take over criminal justice delivery in ways that mitigate entrenched racist and class prejudice prosecution.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very tempting idea, because to stem the rate of violence, it's hard to say don't do that. And it's kind of like what I wrote in this essay. It's kind of the way that I feel about refugee law. where refugee law works for those who can access it, but it's only a portion of people who access it. And then it distracts us from the fact that the border violence that goes on because of immigration regulation is the problem, not the fact that we have some small, way of remedying potential persecution for a small amount of people. And similarly, I think, to have a liberal, let's just make an example of a liberal state prosecutor, who doesn't want to perpetuate the status quo and wants to somehow remedy some aspect of it. I think that can stop violence maybe or it can mitigate violence for a group of people, but it's not going to actually address the underlying ideas, beneath the surface, which is, why do we have this penal approach more generally? How do we shift resources and thinking and commitments towards making society a better place to live in so that people don't have, aren't in the conditions that that are going to make them, to just basically harm them on a constant basis? And how do we live with each other? I mean, so I don't know if a Philly DA will ever be the answer, that we're looking for. And if, I probably would choose to have someone who's going to try to work to stem the flow of violence. But I think we have to be aware that can distract and maybe apportion resources towards that as a strategy. And I just think that that's a really limited strategy on its own.
Great. Yeah, I've got does anyone else have something they would like to add into that? I see a reply in the chat. Thinking about tactics and strategy, what's the best way forward? Getting beaten up by the police doesn't appeal. Yeah, does anyone want to kind of to speak to that thought that once if you take a more there are real risks involved, aren't there, in resisting policing? And maybe that's something that we can talk about. What forms of resistance to this was another of the questions actually, and what forms of resistance to policing do you find inspiring? And why do you think that they're important? And what are the risks that are involved? This is a question to all of you.
I mean, I can maybe say a few words, but I think I'm saying them with Lamble's chapter like still in my head from having read it earlier, and your use of that beautiful Ruth Wilson Gilmore quote about abolition being about presence, not absence. That it's very easy to get into a mindset and a rhetoric around abolition that focuses on the struggle to make something that exists not exist, and miss the work that is transformational, which is about building the social relations, the social institutions, the social structure that supplant the police, that make policing irrelevant, that help us to do away with policing. And that involves kind of ways of thinking about justice, that involves forms of community and community accountability that aren't reliant on harm and punishment and coercion. Like, that work is so integral to thinking about police abolition, and a version of police abolition that doesn't center presence is going to get really tied to the thing that you're opposing. Like, I'm going to go on and say, like, there's still really important work to be done that is based on opposing the police, on trying to get rid of police institutions and police forces, on maybe fighting with police in the street. Like, the point isn't that confrontation might not be incredibly important, that police monitoring isn't important, riots don't have a productive force, but if you only have that focus, one is that's a focus that's incredibly dangerous for the people involved, but like, you actually just become completely tied to the thing you're opposing if you only think in terms of how do we negate the thing in that respect. Like, real transformation, lasting transformation, meaningful transformation comes when you develop, when you prefigure, when you kind of create forms of community that don't need policing and that don't need the police. And like, that stuff can be very quiet. Like Lamble, your chapter, you talk about it beautiful. That stuff can be every day. That stuff can be broadly invisible, but is absolutely integral to kind of creating and experimenting with social relations that aren't tied to policing, punishment, and so forth.
I can just pick that up. I think there's, you know, Koshka, when you're asking about a fact or something that you learned, you know, when I was taught by a policing scholar, I remember learning that, you know, we're given the impression from all the crime culture and the cop culture shows that cops are constantly intervening in crime. You know, like someone calls the cops and the police immediately get there and they intervene and they stop the bad thing from happening. And I remember from this policing scholar who taught me that actually the reality is the vast majority of time that police spend is paperwork. They're paper pushers. They're not actually on the street intervening in crime. They're doing other things. And when they do get called, they often they're calling after something has happened. They don't intervene. They're responding in the aftermath of something. And then even when you look at the crimes that are reported, it's like, you know, it's only something like 10 to 12%, maybe 15% max of crimes get reported that actually even result in pursuing it as a prosecution. So it's like it's a tiny, tiny fragment of harm or crime that police actually intervene in. So they're already not intervening. And so I think when we ask the question about what we want to do instead, it's like, well, communities who have never been able to call the cops because it's not safe to call the cops, because if you're afraid of getting shot or killed or deported or whatever, those communities have developed resources to support each other when a harm happens. And I think we need to be investing in more of those resources. And one of the ways that we can also do that is to ask ourselves, I mean, for communities that are, you know, lots of communities just don't call the cops because it's not okay. But there are also lots of communities, especially white middle class communities, who are taught that the police are going to protect them, who will call the cops. And I think one of the things that we can do is actually ask ourselves, do I need to call the cops? And Abolitionist Futures is actually working on a British version of a resource that I'm going to put in the chat, which is, do I need to call the police? And I'll just put it. And you can see one of the things it's asking is, like, we know that police are responding all the time to mental health crisis, for example, and whether, you know, you don't have to hate the police to recognize that the police are not well equipped to deal with mental health crisis, right? And lots of people who are killed by police or injured by police are injured because someone has called in response to a mental health crisis. And so one of the questions that we need to ask is, what resources do we need to support people who are in mental health crisis that aren't taking a kind of punitive approach and are actually a supportive approach, so that when someone's in crisis, they get the support that they need. And lots of communities do that. And people are creating resources around how to do that. And I think we need to do more work in building up those resources and giving people access to the tools, because we in our communities actually do a lot of that work and can continue to do that work, so that people don't feel like the only option is to call the cops and to risk getting hurt or risk someone getting arrested or risk, you know, the harm that comes from that. We have the capacity within our own communities to access resources and supports and build our skills to be able to deal with those crises without relying on a violent institution.
Yeah, what you were just saying there, Lamble, that example that you gave, and I see also coming in the chat, digital folks with learning disabilities and neurodivergent folks, really important point there. It makes me reflect on another really great question that I've seen popping up in the Q&A, which is around effective alternatives to policing. I think one of the questions that I always feel like needs to be asked first of all when that kind of question comes up is, well, what exactly do we mean by an alternative? Because one way of thinking about alternatives is something else that performs the same function. But if we're looking at a great deal of the function of policing, going back to what you were saying at the outset, Chris, looking at kind of the function of policing to maintain, enforce, and also historically to kind of help create in the first place vast inequalities, kind of globally and locally of wealth, resources, social status, power. They're there to enforce a hierarchical social order and to kind of suppress and warehouse people who don't fit into it or who are resisting it. And obviously you don't want some alternative institution that's going to perform that same function more efficiently. That is a function you don't want to replicate. And rather you want to think about, what, and I think this is something that you explained so well in your chapter, Lamble, you want to ask that question, what would have to change in order for that level of violence no longer to be required to keep things running? But then at the same time, there are valuable social functions that are currently being, and kind of necessary social functions, in caring for people in crisis, for example. And we can also ask about the kind of the social conditions that produce those crises in the first place. But there are kind of things that we really do need to help each other with, and that are currently being placed onto the shoulders of an institution whose main kind of their trump card is a truncheon. That's what they've got to bring to the situation. And so we can think about alternative ways of kind of caring for each other, as well as thinking about how much we do not want to replace that core function of policing. So with that's like my little spin on the question. But I would like to put the question out to you, because I think it's a fantastic one. What would you say is the most effective yet accessible way of communicating how the transition away from policing would look? Can you give an example of an effective alternative?
Is this to anybody?
This is to anybody, yes, absolutely. Becca, come in.
So I think in lots of ways, Lamble's kind of already answered that question with descriptions of things like, what does it mean? I mean, even in a really utilitarian way, right? Like, if a massive amount of what the police are doing is coming to meet people with mental health crisis, and that's having less than desirable outcomes, to use that kind of institutional language, then an alternative to policing, or a good example of it, becomes, well, what are really good examples of supportive mental health interventions that allow people to get better without exerting coercive force onto them, or meaning that they may be, exposed to just kind of direct physical violence, or, they may experience their, when somebody's called to support them, they actually experience that as an incredibly traumatic event, which doesn't make anything better, right? So you can imagine, even with an example as kind of simple as that, in lots of kind of small and bigger ways. And I think one of the kind of, going back to the question of tactics and strategy that's important, I think building that presence, building the things that we need, is not only about the kind of small day-to-day things that we can do, but also about building that kind of infrastructure. And if we had equivalent kind of resource to deal with community run, supportive, transparent, democratically organized mental health support within our communities, what might that look like? And that's something which could be developed, in quite a short period of time. And I remember one, in terms of a specific example, I think it was at the Abolitionist Futures Conference. I think they were Crime Think. I'm not 100% sure. There was an American organization who had done exactly this work, because they had noticed not only that police were regularly coming to meet mental health crises, but also that there was this overlap and increasing collaboration between mental health support services and policing, which meant that even when you were in something that was supposed to be specifically for health and care and support, you would often be subject to different forms of policing. You may have the cops called on you. And what this organization did was to organize with the workers in the mental health care facilities to think about how they could better run it, and to give them a range of different skills to be able to intervene in people with people who are in crisis to be able to de-escalate situations. They used lots of people who had lived experience of being in those kind of institutions to kind of inform what a better strategy would look like. And after a number of months of training, they then were able to, at a range of clinics in the area, get them to make commitments to not call 911 when somebody who was in their care was in a kind of acute crisis and they would have otherwise called the cops. They now had this whole suite, as Lamble said before, of skills, of tactics, of people that they were able to call. They had developed an entire infrastructure of care, which made the police totally obsolete and therefore better protected the people who were in their care and who may be experiencing a mental health crisis at that particular moment. I think that's one example. But I think when you open up that kind of that way of thinking about stuff, right, in answer to the person's question, you can then start to imagine all kinds of other alternatives. I mean, what is the kind of stuff that happens in society that we don't like, that is hard, that is difficult? Actually, we can scrap much of the way that it's already dealt with, particularly by the police, and start thinking about how do we build infrastructure that deals with this in ways that work and that, you know, are not saturated with violence.
Yeah, absolutely. I see a few really great comments in the chat that I would just read out for anyone who couldn't see them. Saying over 50% of people in prison in the UK and US are dyslexic, let alone other forms of neurodivergence. And somebody else saying, I'm so worried about this as a mother of a boy with learning disabilities and autism. Folks are dying in secure units. And I think something that really that this brings out a really important point, which is that policing doesn't just happen under the banner policing. It also happens under the banner kind of care and protection. And the thought that kind of carceral institutions, so institutions that operate by locking people up and segregating them from other parts of society, that those don't always say over their door, this is a kind of this is punitive. Sometimes they say this is caring, and even the kind of euphemisms around police stations themselves, they talk about them as having custody suites. You will be like, stripped naked and beaten on the floor of a custody suite is how it works. And yeah, I think something that you brought out really well in what you were saying there, Becca, was just how and I know that you've researched and written about this more elsewhere, in the context of, for example, immigration detention as well, which is another area where the claims are made that the people being incarcerated are being kind of looked after, and it's not really a prison. That's a really important point. Thanks, Lamble, for sharing more resources in the chat. When this recording is shared, we will make sure that the resources are all included along with it. And this point about government slashing budgets for early mental health intervention, seeing that in schools. And I guess something else that brings out is that there's always the resources that are being funneled into policing are always being taken away from something else. I've seen we've gone past the hour because there've been so many great questions. You've been saying great things. I don't want to kind of go on for too much longer because it's quite late at night. But I thought maybe I could just ask for a kind of final comment from everybody, and then we can wrap up. So Eddie, do you want to kick off with just a final reflection?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really it's a great discussion to be having, and I feel like more people should get involved because the questions are questions that I sometimes grapple with, having thought about these questions quite a lot. And it's a process, and it's being in conversation with people that I think gets it really to be really internalized that abolition isn't some idea way far in the future. It's a process of thinking through and these practices, and it's things that we can do now and things that we can envision now and practically implement. So I mean, I think that's for me the biggest takeaway from the last few years of being exposed to literature on abolition and organizations like Abolition Futures, and reading groups, and kind of, so I would say just find a reading group and become part of this discussion, because it really changes your outlook. And I'll just say it really resonates, because I live right next to a bar and a pub and a restaurant. And, you know, there are break-ins every now and again, and sometimes we know who's doing it, but sometimes people call the police. The police never come. I mean, that's by the by. But they do come when we don't call them. So, for instance, I was coming home one night and I get surrounded by 6 police officers who are just like, what are you doing here? And albeit it doesn't look like there's a door where my door is, but it's basically a public road that leads to a park that happened to be closed. And everyone from the pub comes out and they're like, we always call you, you never come, and now you come and harass the neighbor. But it was just, it's, you know, when it happens, it's still shocking. For some reason, it's so shocking. But I just think of the resources that could be then channeled to the people who are all, you know, in my neighborhood who need them. And so I feel like that sparks I think the drive now to kind of find some of those ways to make that a reality. So I just, yeah, so I'm looking forward to having more conversations like this with people.
Oh, thank you, Eddie. Lamble, do you have a final comment you'd like to make?
Yeah, I guess just 2 things I would say. One, I saw there was lots of questions that were really trying to grapple with a specific problem, like what happens when something very harmful is happening in your community? What do you do about it? Or there's a crisis situation or a violent situation. And I would say for all of these things, you know, I have run workshops before where we try and get people to think about an acute problem that is happening currently in their community, whether it's, you know, you hear your neighbors and you're concerned about domestic violence, or somebody is, you know, dealing drugs outside your house and you're worried about kids getting exposed to that, or you're, you know, concerned about somebody who's, you know, got acute mental health needs, who's on the street, and you're concerned about them. I would say it's amazing if you gather a group of people together in your neighborhood or in your family or in your workplace or whatever, and have a chat, like take 15 minutes and just have a conversation and ask each other, what are all the ways that we could try and deal with this problem that doesn't rely on the police? And you'll be amazed at what people, when they collectively come together, can identify resources that already exist in their community, or can identify resources that they want to create in their community to make it possible to solve and address these problems. Now, those aren't going to be solved just by at the micro level. We have to be doing it at the macro level as well. And so the other point I would just make is I think people often don't always make the connections that most of the change that has to happen is not within the criminal justice system. We need to shrink the criminal justice system, and we need to grow the other systems. And so campaigns to fight for fully funded, properly, you know, sourced, non-punitive mental health care is an abolitionist struggle. Fighting for affordable housing is an abolitionist struggle. Fighting for adequate health care, fighting for income security, fighting against, you know, homelessness. These are all things that are part of abolitionist struggle. And we need to connect the dots and be like, the work that we are doing to build the caring community and the infrastructures of support and care that we need are what build that abolitionist presence and enable us to then shrink and deplete and eventually eliminate the police and prison systems. And we all have a part to play in that. And I think we can all do that if we do it collectively.
Amazing. Becca, what would you like to say? Closing remarks.
Closing remarks, I think only just to say thank you, like thank you for everybody who's here, and thank you to all of the organisers, both of this event and also, you know, everybody that was involved in getting the book together. I think I totally agree with what Lamble's saying. The only question I see the last question in the Q&A, which is about the worry with regards to alternative structures, is that the state is inherently monopolistic. And as soon as alternatives threaten its power base, violence is not far behind. So I guess I will add to the positive abolitionist imagination and the building of those systems, which we can all get involved in a range of different ways. That yes, we have seen from history, we know that when these kind of things are built to a certain level, there is oftentimes a violent response from the state. And I don't want to paper over that. And I guess thinking about the relationship between the far right and the police demonstrates the way in which there is a serious threat of violence to some of us more than others, but there is a serious threat of violence from these institutions. And I guess I just wanted to kind of say, if we are gonna overthrow these systems, it's not always gonna be nice, but that's what systemic and revolutionary change looks like. And I think a lot of the abolitionist tradition teaches us that people have also organized themselves to be able to defend themselves from those kind of threats as well. So I guess it's just something that I think is important to keep in mind. I didn't want to drag it down too much, but just because the person asked the question, I thought it was relevant to say it's legit.
Yeah, great point. Chris, would you like to say anything to round off?
Yeah, okay. Thanks everyone, I've really enjoyed this conversation. There's a question in the chat about comparing or contrasting the UK and the US, asking why is police abolition apparently more thinkable in a US context than a UK context, which I think is a really good question. And it's really bad in the UK at the moment. And I think a lot of the support for the police and resistance to police abolition doesn't only come from the kind of, what if this person does this, don't I need the police sensibility? I think that's part of it. But I also think there's a deep ideological commitment on part of a lot of the population of this country that believes in the policing of unruly and racialized people within the UK and internationally. I think there is a kind of an ideological commitment, and we've got a government at the moment that is very adept at harnessing that and rewarding that. And that makes it a very dangerous organizing environment. And it means that in some ways, even though there's more challenge to the police than there's been in a long time, the police are probably more powerful than they've been in some ways as well. Which I'm saying, sorry to be the second one to end on a bit of a downer, but I think that's why these conversations are so important. I think that's why what Lamble and Becca were saying about the incredibly important need to build alternatives, build different ways of thinking and relating at every stage is part of the project of abolition. As Lamble said, this is about mental health care, this is about education, this is about kind of every part of community, but related to that is the need to defend communities. There are a lot of communities, migrant communities, racialized communities, people with mental health who are at so much risk from the police at the moment. And a government that is lockstep with giving the police whatever powers they want. And so a twin strategy of building new structures, but also of organizing to defend communities from the police couldn't be more important at the moment. And that's why I'm so glad this book has come out, that we're having this conversation, that actually so many books on kind of challenging and confronting police power are coming out at the moment and conversations are happening. And I think that's had never been so important. So yeah, thank you all for coming, and thank you everyone for this rich conversation.
Yeah, I would like to echo what everyone's been saying in terms of how important I feel this conversation is, and just I get so many messages since kind of being out in public talking about policing. I get so many messages from people's kind of coming from all different perspectives, but saying how much it matters to them, and that's really inspiring, as well as the kind of conversations that I'm lucky enough to get to have with all of my students, hearing about their experiences and perspectives on policing, and that's the to kind of that's the more hopeful note is the kind of the incredibly open conversations that are happening at the moment. I just wanted to end, I think, by picking up on another really thoughtful comment in the questions, which is kind of saying that people who are defending policing and defending the penal system, often under the kind of banner of liberalism, a complex political philosophy with a complex history, but that they tend to have, it says in this comment, liberals tend to have a rather pessimistic view of humanity, and that can be hard to challenge. And that idea that humans are bad and that's why we need the police. I think that is a kind of a widespread way of thinking about things. But I would like to kind of push back on that for a moment and sort of say that people who believe that the police can be can, with a bit of reform, be fundamentally an all right institution. That is the wild sunshine and unicorns, because the thought that you can give that much power and that much impunity to a bunch of people socialized in an incredibly violent society, an incredibly kind of violent, like white supremacist, imbued with kind of hierarchical gender at its core society, give them a bunch of weapons and a bunch of impunity and be like, use it for good. That, I think, is the kind of pie in the sky. And so in order to kind of course, we do have to believe that human beings are capable of cooperating and caring for each other, but we see examples of that like everywhere and all of the time. I think an abolitionist approach to policing is really much more realistic, in that it takes seriously the thought that hierarchy and kind of giving people power of the kind that they could abuse is not a great way of preventing abuses of power. And so we need to be realistic about that. And I think that's where I would end. And I wanted to just also thank all of the authors who are here, the audience, for your amazing questions, but to say how special this project has been to me, how important it's been to me, and like what an honor it's been to work with, to work and discuss with all of you. Thank you very much.